we continue in our Bible study, and we have a little bit, we need to finish up from Revelation chapter 16 as we were looking at the seven bowl judgments. And so let's see if we can really quickly just remember what the seven judgments were. So the first one was
on the land.
On the earth. Swords,
okay. So the painful swords. I think one translation even puts it that they were tumors. So painful swords. The second,
oceans.
that all the oceans and the seas turned to blood. The third,
The rivers and springs of blood.
so all the fresh water. So you get all the salt water, then all the fresh water. So all the sources of water in the world, by the time the second and the third bowls are poured out, are to turn to blood. What is the fourth?
Sun scorching.
The sun is scorching hot. What is the fifth?
Darkness.
Total darkness. What is the sixth?
Euphrates River dries up.
The drying up of the Euphrates River. And then the seventh?
Is lightning, thunder, and earthquake.
The way I described it was a massive and explosive geological event. That would be the nice scientific way of saying a really, really, really big earthquake.
That second one where the scripture said, water became like blood of a corpse. I was thinking about that. It's like the blood of a corpse had no oxygen in it. And so, instead of becoming blood, like the blood of a corpse, no oxygen.
No oxygen in it. Yeah, drying out the oxygen in the water. Well, and it's always interesting because, last week I was sharing how it sounds like some of the descriptions you've given that where people describe it like a super volcano, and even some of the prior bowls that could be, imagery wise, have y'all seen video stuff from like the volcanic eruptions in like Hawaii, where there's almost a constant volcanic flow on at least one of those islands, and you'll have what looks like a red fiery lava going into the ocean, and you sure would not want to drink that water that lava is going into. So it's interesting to see some, and it does make you wonder, just as we've talked about before, John is using everyday language, or at least everyday language that he has, to describe things that he probably is having trouble giving a good description of. Now, admittedly, he's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but God used the knowledge, God used the experiences, God used the authors and the gifts that He had given them, their strengths and their weaknesses, in penning the scriptures. And so I can't help but wonder, as John sees, I'd love to actually see exactly what John saw, or maybe I wouldn't love to see exactly what John saw, because if you get some of the descriptions that he gives are a bit terrifying, but it would be interesting to see. But you have all seven of these bowls that are poured out in rapid succession, unlike the prior series of seven judgments, where there have been some breaks in the action, so to speak. There's no breaks in the action here. It is one after another, after another, after another, until the final is poured out. Then we looked at some of the ways this has been interpreted, and we looked at the futurist perspective, which obviously sees these events as literal events that will occur in the future. And then we looked at the idealist perspective, which sees these events symbolically. And the idea being that God punishes all the earthly sinful powers, as well as sinners who do not repent. So then we have two more perspectives. And if you have your note sheet from last time, you can use that portion there. However, I did on tonight's note sheet just give you the opportunity, if you want to use that, because we'll be looking at the historical, the preterist perspective for the bowls of God's wrath. So I make sure to put that on there for tonight, but if you're OCD and it just has to be completed from last week, then feel free, to use last week's in that regard. But, the two perspectives that we missed were the historicist and the preterist. And it's our discussions that we've had on this have been rather interesting, because these were, okay, so the futurist, it's a bit easier to say that this is symbolic, or maybe we view this as literal, but it's all directed towards the future. And so there's a certain level of, uncertainty, so to speak. I mean, we can know what we believe in that regards, but there still is a certain level of uncertainty. And with the idealist, it's kind of the same thing. It's very symbolic. And symbols, there are a lot of people that look at certain symbols and come up with different views on it. And so whenever you start getting to the historicists and the preterists, they're looking at historical events and applying the text to those historical events. So it gets a bit more difficult, a bit more challenging. So the historicist, just as a bit of a reminder, the historicist, this is the one that looks at Revelation, giving some prophecy for the church age, leading up to that. Just about all of the historicists go to like Revelation 20, 21, and 22 being future, but Revelation 1 through 19 are events that are occurring or have occurred. In their mind, John was seeing something that was going to happen up through modern times, and what we're looking at now is kind of living in. Depending on the historicist commentary that you read, we might be living in like chapter 19 or chapter 18 or something like that. But they'll, for the most part, they're looking at Revelation as prophecy about things that would occur during the church age. So the historicist sees these judgments specifically as the way that the papacy would be punished for their at the time of the Reformation, for the things that the papacy had done. And so this is what they see here in the bold judgments is the events of the French Revolution. Now, how many of you have ever heard of the French Revolution? The French Revolution took place, obviously, in what country? France. And it's significant for a couple reasons. One, which of the religious movements, so to speak, the Christian religious movements, was in control in France prior to the French Revolution?
Roman Catholic.
The Roman Catholics, absolutely. In fact, there was a period of time that you kind of have the Pope is in exile from Italy, and he actually finds himself in France. And so the French they were very entrenched in the Roman Catholic Church. And so the French Revolution, outside of the battles that took place, specifically between them and the British and so forth, one of the things you also see is this is kind of the rise of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment begins to kind of question religious truth. And so there is almost a literal attack on religious values and on the church. And then there's a figurative attack on the religious power that's holding on. And so the French Revolution really did attack all of religion, but especially the Roman Catholic Church, as it was the most powerful religious group in France. When it speaks of all the blood in the seas, it is seen as a result of great bloodshed in the sea battles between the French and the British. Did I miss something?
No.
I did.
The French defeated the French.
No. The French are heavily defeated by the English in naval battles, and the amount of dead, the blood floating in the water would have, at least in that moment, made it look like the water had turned to blood. Then in the third bowl, which is the rivers turning to blood, Napoleon invades Italy, and which is the home of what major city? Rome. And so the church, when Napoleon goes in, he kind of cripples Italy, including the church, and there's many people that die on Napoleon's advance into Italy, with dead bodies piling up on the banks of the rivers and turning the river water into blood. So they would say that this was a literal event that occurred when Napoleon invaded Italy. In the one where the sun kind of heating up to where it burns, they take this one symbolically. The sun, you want to make a wild guess what the sun sometimes represents, at least in biblical times. Well, I mean, for us, yes. I mean, but
SUN.
yes, the SU. I'll give you a clue. There was somebody who claimed the title of the unconquered sun. The unconquered SUN. It would be a symbol of a major power. So like the unconquered sun, I cannot remember which Roman emperor it was that claimed that title, but there was a Roman emperor who claimed the title of the unconquered sun, SUN. Basically, he was elevating himself to a level beneath. And so, oftentimes the sun could represent a ruler or a power or authority. And so, kind of going back to some other imagery that you see, especially, and this ends up proving itself in science. Does anybody know what happens to a star before it dies out? What? Yeah, supernova. In other words, it gets hotter and brighter. And so the symbolism being that the popes are getting ready to go down in flames, so to speak, literally and figuratively. And so they kind of go supernova, is kind of how the historians would see this. That the Pope and the papal system begins to flame out. Then the next being the darkness or the fifth being the darkness that sets over the world. And you can imagine, even though the papal church was very corrupt, it was to many people a source of order, specifically moral order and spiritual order. And so what happens when you remove the source of moral and spiritual order in a society?
Chaos.
Yeah, absolute chaos. And in this case, spiritual darkness. And so so the darkness here for the historicist is a spiritual event. That the source of morality has been pulled, and even though it was corrupt, it still offered that. And so now there's spiritual, moral, and even political bankruptcy, so to speak. The sixth is when the Euphrates is dried up, and for them, the Euphrates was the border between what was kind of the main thing keeping the Turks from invading through the modern day Middle East and making their way over to Europe. And so it wasn't so much a literal drying up of the Euphrates, so much of it was that the church was going to be losing its God's providential hand in keeping the Turks away. Do you remember what the religion of the Turks was and is?
Muslim.
Yes, Islam. And also, if you know much about the Ottoman Empire, you know that when they came in hard. In fact, Northern Africa is still dealing with the results. Northern Africa, the Middle East, they had gotten into portions of Spain. They went across, I can't remember that, Gibraltar, where Spain's closest point to Africa. And they invaded Spain, made their ways up to a significant portion of Spain. And were really pressing in on Europe until there was a battle, and don't ask me which one, but there was a battle in Spain that kind of turned the tides, and the Ottoman Empire was not able to advance in much more into Western Europe, and actually ended up being pushed back across into Africa. But what the historians see here is that this removed the protection for Europe from Turk invasion, and the Turks invaded, and even the Catholic Church as you know it now still bears scars of that, as you have the Orthodox Church and you have the Roman Catholic Church. And so they're still feeling the effects of what the historicists would say is the sixth bowl. And then the seventh is a judgment that is yet to come. So where most of the historicists would agree is that the specific event that is described in the seventh bowl has obviously not occurred yet. And so that's how the historicists would see. Any questions or comments on the way the historicists see the seventh bowl?
If they see these plagues as symbolic, do they see the ones in Egypt symbolic too? I'm just wondering.
So I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Because what they're going to say is the book of Exodus is not apocalyptic.
Okay.
Now, there may be some that do. In fact, there are. I don't know if they're historians, but there are plenty of scholars that will say that the book of Exodus is not a historical account of what happened with Israel.
Okay.
In fact, what they will say, and I know this, there's a podcast I listen to. Just a little side note: don't always listen to everything you agree with. Listen to perspectives from the other side, because if you're always listening to what you agree with, you'll never know how to respond to someone who's coming from the other direction. Well, one of the podcasts I listen to is somebody who comes from this, I just will say, more scholarly perspective, although there are plenty of scholars on the other side as well. But the way that he presents it is that there was a group of people that were already living in what would be modern day Israel that rose up to power and were looking for a history. And so they wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. So they fabricated the events, is what they say. Now, is that what I believe? Absolutely not. And are there many scholars that disagree with them? Absolutely. But there are a collection of Old Testament scholars that say that the Pentateuch was a fabricated history to give this new kingdom that has risen up under a man by the name of David some authority, some historical authority. So there are some that would look at Exodus as symbolic, or at least mythological. However, I think that there are some that would view Exodus as literal, but would not see, but they might withhold the historicist interpretation, if that makes sense. And they would say it's because this is apocalyptic literature, whereas Exodus is intended to be a theological history of the people of Israel. All right, let's look at the preterist. And as I've come to understand, this is everybody's favorite one. So, the preterist, this is the view that centers the events that John is seeing around AD 70 and shortly thereafter, or maybe the couple of centuries thereafter, as it specifically hits on the events of the fall of Jerusalem and then God's punishment on the people on the Roman Empire. Now, I will say, and I came across this in doing some reading in preparation for other things, that there are some, and I don't want to muddy the waters, but there are some preterists who believe that all of the judgment, that every bit of Revelation is about the fall of Jerusalem. So, the preterists I've been talking about, after the seven seals, then the rest of the judgment is on Rome and the centers of the world. There's a second group of preterists that say that it is the same story told 3 times, really hinting at God punishing the city of Jerusalem. I have not seen as much about it. However, I said all that to say that, especially whenever we're getting into Revelation 17, you're going to see some of that pop up, and I'll point it out to you when we get to it. But at least at least from what I can tell, the predominant view is that after the 7 seals, that's the fall of Jerusalem. And then from that point forward from that point to about Revelation 20, is God now turning around and punishing the people of Rome. I hope it didn't muddy the waters too much, but I did want to be as open as I could about the preterist perspective of the book of Revelation. So how have they interpreted the bowls? The first bowl is figurative, and it's that people begin to sour on Rome. In other words, the people viewed it positively, but now people are starting to view it negatively, and they're starting to push back. And so it is these tumors, these sores are. It shouldn't be figurative sours. It should be figurative sores. But they are symbolic. It goes to show you the pastor can be a shocker, right? That these are kind of, well, I mean, you've heard of somebody say that person's a cancer.
Yeah.
How the preterist sees it is various groups begin to rise within Rome and begin to become cancerous or sores to the empire itself. There's a dinosaur back there.
Cast out demons.
The second and third bowls were plenty of times of great death that were seen together. In other words, great bloodshed. The battles that led to the fall of Rome were bloody. And so, much like the historicists saw this as being fulfilled by literal blood in the waters, the preterists see this as the fall, as Rome was falling, the various battles that took place both on land and at sea, that led to the defeat of the Roman Empire were bloody events. The fourth bowl they see this similar to the way that the historicists saw this, that it was a power burning out. But instead of it being the Roman Catholic Church that's went supernova and is going to be falling out, it's now the power of Rome. The powers of Europe that went scorched earth, the powers of Europe that went scorched earth on Rome in its destruction. The fifth bowl, which is darkness, is turmoil in Rome when it falls. And when I say Rome, not just the city, but the entire empire. Once again, you take, especially the way the Roman Empire ruled, everything went back to the city of Rome, correct? And so you remove Rome, or not literally, but remove the power that Rome is exerting on the empire. What happens to the empire? It falls. So this would once again be symbolic for them. The sixth bowl, all the enemies of the empire are able to advance. And this would be the Persians to the east were always a continual threat to the Roman Empire, and so this would be that the protection that they had would dry up, so to speak, and the Persians would be able to be invaded. And then the seventh is a figurative event, and just as it speaks of the earth being divided in the earthquakes, if you know anything about the fall of the Roman Empire, you know that really what ended up causing the fall was that one emperor, when he died, he had four sons. Four sons, and he split the Roman Empire into four different regions, and each of his sons was supposed to rule a region of the Roman Empire. Well, I have two brothers, and I love my brothers to death, but I can only imagine if we were given that type of authority, you know, there'd probably a couple times I wanted to elbow my brother out of the way to get a little more power, right? Well, that's exactly what happened here. These four brothers did not necessarily get along, and you see the evidences of it as that really begins what is an ultimate downfall of the Roman Empire. There were some that tried to unite the Roman Empire moving forward, but when it was divided like that, it kind of was the beginning of the end. And so what many preterists would say is that division was a literal division that was brought on, but it wasn't a geological earthquake, it was a political earthquake. And the way that it destroyed Rome. So any questions or comments about the preterist perspective? I will say this, probably of all of the preterist attempts to describe or to interpret it in historical events, this is probably the one that at least comes closest to fitting, even if it doesn't fit necessarily, really. It's almost like they found some puzzle pieces that, you ever doing a puzzle and you get a piece that fits almost, it's like one little portion, you just sit there and beat it in and make it fit. Well, at some points, I think that's a little bit of what's happened. But whenever you're that committed, and admittedly, I think rather we want to admit it or not, we all kind of do this sometimes with our theological perspectives if we're not careful. We'll have a theological assumption that we come to the Bible with, and we'll take a verse of scripture that doesn't quite fit in and may actually challenge our theological perspective. And instead of changing our theological perspective, we will change the interpretation of that scripture to make it fit our theological perspective. I've done it unintentionally in my walk as a Christian. I look back on some of the things that I've never stood and taught heresy or anything like that. Please understand what I'm saying. I've never done that. But I have looked and said, man, I did some theological gymnastics right there to make that verse say that. when that's not what it said. Oh, yeah, yeah, I think we all have at certain points. I, I've been, y'all heard me talk about like Calvinism versus Arminianism. There are some of those discussions that I've had with some individuals where I've seen both do that, because this verse over here almost sticks out as one that doesn't fit in with their system. And I've seen both parties have to do some interpretive gymnastics to make it work.
That's like the old preacher joke, I got a good sermon, I got to find a scripture to back it up.
I had a professor in, it was Dr. Roy Brandon. He was our preaching professor when I was at Campbell. And on the first day of our preaching class, he said, raise your hand if you've ever heard a sermon that was looking for a text. And we all raised our hands. He said, well, I hope it wasn't you that was preaching it. And he said, by the end of this course, you won't be. But I've always remembered that, and there have been a few sermons I've heard that was a sermon looking for a text. I thank God that God gave me a good education that I could, instead of have a sermon looking for a text, it's a text that informs the sermon. And if I ever preach outside of that, I want y'all to let me know. That was one of those sermons looking for a text this morning. And hold me accountable on that. Any other discussion on the 7 bowls? 7 bowl judges. All right. Well, let's shift over to Revelation 17. And I want to begin by asking a question. And it's the one that you have it on your notes there. You also have on screen in front of you. I want you to tell me, what is the worst thing, and let's take it lighthearted at first. What's the worst thing somebody could call you?
Lighthearted.
Yeah, like for instance, if somebody called me a Tar Heel fan, I would take great exception to that. Can you think of one that you might joke around about, like, how dare you call me that?
I've been called Frankenstein.
That's something.
And then Frank the Army Tank. Frank Furter. That was just at Lee's Chapel. I'm just kidding.
Well, how about if somebody was to call you a Yankee? Anybody here that would take offense to that?
I don't have a thing hanging up my house, but I got here as soon as I can, so
Yeah.
Well, I know some people that would, if they were called like if you were we'll just say a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and somebody called you a Democrat or called you a liberal, or vice versa. If you were a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, somebody mistakenly called you a Republican or called you a conservative, or I know some people that would take that as highly offensive, that their identity is wrapped up in their politics, so to speak. Would anybody in here take offense to being called a bad driver? How about this? Would you take offense to being called a thief? Okay, what about being called a murderer? Or a liar? Or unfaithful? Well, God goes one step farther in Revelation 17 as he gives a symbol that it's a symbolic vision, and in this symbolic vision, the person that God is chastising is calling out in this vision. Depending on your translation, they may soften it up a little bit, or it might be a term that we don't use as much now. But the idea is, he calls that this person in this is what's the term used for the woman in Revelation 17?
Great prostitute.
Mine says whore.
Okay, so you have whore, you have harlot, is, I believe the King James Version, I believe says harlot. I could be wrong on that, but I believe so. And then, some of your other modern translations will say prostitute. But either ways, like raise your hand if you'd just be happy if somebody called you one of those. There's a lot of negative connotations to it. In fact, I'll never forget the first time I really seriously read the book of Hosea. Anybody in here ever read the book of Hosea? What is it that God tells Hosea to do? Marry a prostitute. Why is that?
Well, it's symbolic of the faithfulness of Israel.
Exactly. God, through Hosea, tells her, now, one, that would be a sin for to go and associate with, in fact, right now I'm reading through Proverbs, and one of the chapters I just read, there's at least 4 times in that chapter of Proverbs where the author says, my son, stay away from those women. And so obviously that's a big deal. And Hosea does it, but it's because God is using this to get the people's attention. And once again, it's being used to get the attention. So let's begin by reading verses 1 through 6. Would somebody read Revelation 17, 1 through 6 for me?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of those fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous things. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abomination. And I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. How far did you say?
Through the end of that verse.
Okay. And when I saw her, I was greatly amazed.
So, just a quick question. How many of you, every time that word whore came up, kind of like tensed up a little bit? You know, it's not like that. I can imagine that the responses, and I'm sure I'm fairly certain it happened when people preach through the book of Revelation, and you get that, and you're reading it in front of your people in church that morning. I imagine there's probably a few audible gasps as this title is used in the scriptures. So let's take a look at what is being said to occur in this vision. And remember, this is Revelation is this one vision, one overall vision that God has given to John, and so this is kind of another episode of that vision. So one of the 7 angels that poured out the bowls of God's wrath tells John that he's going to show him something else. And so what is it that the angel is going to show John according to verses 1 and 2?
Punishment of the